Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Gary and Great Eastern Rangers, for inviting me to do the opening presentation at this conference, which looks like a really, really exciting lineup. And from my perspective, is very excellent timing because it's hot on the heels of the Australian government's, the launch of the Australian government's new Threatened Species Action Plan, which I'll take the opportunity to talk a little bit about today. I'd like to thank Auntie Kathy for sharing a bit of her family history and also that welcome to country, always really appreciated. And I'd like to acknowledge the Yugara and Turrbal traditional owners of the land on where my feet are and we're meeting today, their elders past and present, and also to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and speakers who may be here today. I'll be really focusing on the conservation of Australia's plants and animals. And so I'd also like to acknowledge that our plants and animals are really central to the cultural identity of our First Nations peoples. Now, let me have a little go with this clicker. Oh, was that there all along? Oh, it just read my mind, I think. So great, we're off to a good start. So look, I'm going to cover a few things, a bit of an overview on Australia's biodiversity, state of play. I'll then talk about the role of the Australian government and my office in the conservation of threatened species. I'll give a couple of examples of where, so I can't quite read that one up there, so you'll just have to excuse me as I turn around here. Talk a little bit about the new Threatened Species Action Plan and a couple of examples of landscape scale conservation efforts, but also species-specific conservation efforts. Talk a little about connecting people for threatened species conservation and then next steps in this space. Okay. So we all know Australia is a special place, but what is it that makes our biodiversity so unique? So Australia's biodiversity is globally significant. We're formally recognised as one of the world's mega diverse countries. Our ecosystems are globally distinct, ranging from alpine, Gary was just talking about some of those areas, temperate, rainforest, freshwater and arid regions. And it is unique. We have species that are evolutionarily distinct, such as the Wallamai pine, pictured here. Around 85% of our plant species are endemic to Australia, only found here, and we have over half the world's marsupials. And this is just a small selection of the facts. The stats on Australian wildlife are really mind-blowing. Thank you. Our wildlife is central to the cultural identity of our First Nations peoples who have managed and shaped this landscape for over 65,000 years, and that stewardship continues. Our biodiversity underpins our economy, our climate, our health and our well-being. And it is a source of pride and wonder for many Australians, and indeed many of us here today are inspired in that commitment to care for and protect our threatened species and their communities. So how is it faring? All of you will be familiar with the State of the Environment report, which was released by the Federal Environment Minister back in July. And it certainly pulls no punches. The report provides a strong message that Australia's environment needs our help and its condition is poor and deteriorating. This is a result of increased pressures from climate change, from habitat loss and degradation, from invasive species, and the list goes on. And of course, these threats interact and are greater than the sum of their parts. We now have over 2,000 plants, animals and ecological communities which are threatened with extinction under national environment law, and this list continues to grow. So you can see from this map here where the densities of these threatened matters are, and many of them are across the Great Eastern Ranges area. The social, environmental and economic impacts are already apparent of this loss. And finally, the authors also talked about the extent of and representativeness of our protected area system, which, while growing, is not sufficient. Thank you. But the State of the Environment authors also highlighted where there have been advances that we should continue to build on. So this includes areas such as innovation and conservation practices, so increased tech. We're also increasingly recognising and embracing the leadership from First Nations peoples as central to biodiversity conservation. And indeed, this State of the Environment report was the first one where all the chapters were co-authored by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander authors. There's been greater engagement across sectors in conservation, which is a good thing. And the authors also noted that the threatened species strategy, where we collectively focused our efforts to bring about species recovery, did deliver results. The authors importantly concluded that immediate action with innovative management and collaboration can turn things around, and it's very important that we continue to focus on that. Thank you. So what is the role of the Australian Government when it comes to threatened species recovery? A key role is to regulate activities under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act to protect threatened species, threatened ecological communities, and other matters of national environmental significance, such as World Heritage Areas and Ramsar sites. And many of you will be aware that the Australian Government is pursuing significant reform of our national environment legislation at the moment and has committed to a full response to the review conducted by Graham Samuels a couple of years back. So this legal protection for our threatened species is really important, but on its own, it is not sufficient. We also need proactive recovery if we're to avoid extinctions and to put many of our species on a better track. The Australian Government therefore provides national leadership through policies and strategies. We invest in on-ground action through programs such as the National Landcare Program and the new Saving Native Species Program, which is coming online, through research through the National Environmental Science Program. The Australian Government's responsible for managing Commonwealth, the Commonwealth estate, so that includes marine and terrestrial national parks. And of course, we work within a federated system, so the states and territories have important roles and responsibilities when it comes to threatened species recovery, and we need to work collaboratively across governments to achieve outcomes in these areas. So where does the Threatened Species Commissioner fit into this puzzle? So I'm the Australian Government's third Threatened Species Commissioner, following on from Dr. Sally Box. And I'm a member of the public service, the Australian Government Public Service, but I have a unique remit to bring a national focus to threatened species recovery. I've got a small but really passionate and committed office, and a shout out to Jill, my colleague, my Brisbane-based colleague who's here with me today. And we work to bring together science, action and partnership in these efforts. A really important part of the role of me and my office is to raise awareness around threatened species recovery, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But a core part of our work is in designing and leading implementation of the Threatened Species Action Plan, which is a national strategy for threatened species recovery and prioritises species, places and mitigation of threats to bring about species recovery. This new Threatened Species Action Plan was launched by Minister Plibersek 2 weeks ago today, and includes ambitious yet feasible, with the right commitment, targets for the recovery of our threatened species over the coming years. The highlights of the action plan, and there's a lot to it, so I'm just going to touch on it really briefly today, includes preventing new extinctions, conserving more than 30% of Australia's land, putting on a better trajectory 110 priority species, that's different sorts of plants and animals all around the country, improving the condition of 20 priority places, and a strong focus on participation of First Nations people in these efforts. And given the audience here today, I'm going to touch a little bit more on the 30% target and the priority places in the action plan. Okay, so one of the in the context of ongoing international discussions, which some of you here are involved in, to develop the global biodiversity framework, the Australian Government has recently gone ahead of that and committed to protect and conserve 30% of Australia's landmass and 30% of our marine areas by 2030. So this commitment provides the global framing for a related action in the Threatened Species Action Plan, which is to conserve 30% of the Australian landmass by 2030, and a 5-year target to get close to that. So currently for marine areas, 45% of that area is protected and 22% of the landmass is protected. So well on the way, but that's still also well over 60 million hectares to protect in that time. So hugely ambitious as well. Factors to consider in this challenge are the representativeness of different bioregions around the country, but also where biodiversity values are going to be realised. And there's a range of opportunities which are currently being explored at the moment, such as Indigenous protected areas and OECMs, the other effective area-based conservation measures in reaching these targets. And one of the really exciting links between the action plan and the Great Eastern Ranges is the priority places focus of the action plan. So they broaden out the influence of the action plan to really be able to focus on threatened ecological communities and multiple threatened species at that priority place. To identify these priority places, my office worked with researchers Stephen Kearney, who some of you will know, and Libby Rumpf, and considered in doing this, it was a long and complex exercise, but in short, the IBRA or the bioregions around Australia, other factors such as key biodiversity areas and important wetlands, Indigenous conservation management arrangements, and of course the assemblages of threatened species and threatened ecological communities in these areas. These priority places and the 20 around the country are the result of this. We also look to have representation across different biomes and across different jurisdictions as well. So these priority places don't have precise boundaries and they don't have regulatory impacts. Rather, they identify areas of national interest for threatened species and ecological communities where we'll focus efforts in partnership with others over coming years. And you can see from the map here that quite a few of these priority places are along the Great Eastern Ranges, and I won't read them all out, but the orange dots, the orange underlines on the map. And as an example of one of the priority places, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Brigalow Country priority place now, which I haven't actually visited before, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of days where I'm going to be learning a whole lot more about this particular place. It's a massive area, largely west to the Divide, as far north as Townsville and sort of going down south to Dubbo. Really important region for First Nations people. Brigalow is a language name for the dominant tree in that area, and I think there's over 3 million hectares under native title in that Brigalow country. It's a really unique ecosystem in a transition zone, but it's been really hammered. So it's lost 90% of its vegetation, mostly for agriculture in the last 50 years, but other pressures right now. And so what remains is isolated, fragmented, often linear patches throughout this landscape. The other threats include the usual suite of threats such as weeds, bufflegrass is a big offender, changed fire regimes and the nasty interaction between the two, and then your full gamut of invasive species adding onto this. Brigalow Country is really a biodiversity hotspot, and you can see on this map threatened ecological communities that more than 10% of Australia's nationally listed threatened ecological communities are found across this area, and such as some of those pictured here. So there's the Brigalow dominant woodland, there's a semi-evergreen vine thicket, and poplar box grassy woodland, just to name a handful. And these Brigalow ecosystems support a really fantastic assemblage of wildlife and threatened plants and animals. So the Brigalow belt has the highest bird diversity of any bioregion in Australia, including the black-breasted button quail, the cute little fella pictured here, and a really diverse assemblage of reptiles, including the collared delma, which is one of the species prioritised in the new Threatened Species Action Plan, and amazing assemblage of fauna as well. And got a picture of the king bluegrass here, which again is one of the threatened plants in the Threatened Species Action Plan. So the Brigalow offers a lot of room for condition improvement in coming years, but we're certainly not starting from scratch in this endeavour. So there's solid partnerships already well underway and a really decent body of science and knowledge to inform management and recovery action over coming years. And the idea is that we will work to support these partnerships at each of these priority places to focus on achieving a meaningful improvement in condition or threat mitigation over the next 5 years. And in the Brigalow, based on the knowledge that we have to date, this is likely to focus on strategies such as management of fire, improving those fire regimes and weed management, habitat protection and restoration in important biodiversity areas. Okay, so I'm just switching tack here a little to talk about a specific plant, and I guess I wanted to use an example such as this because working in threatened species recovery, any of you who work specifically in this space, it can be very challenging and overwhelming, and it's very important to keep our eye on the fact that when we do focus efforts, we really can make a difference, sometimes over short periods of time. So this is the beautiful small purple pea, Swainsona recta. It's endangered under our National Environment Law, and it was a priority species under the first threatened species strategy. And so through raising the profile of this species and some targeted action, its lot in life improved over that 5-year period. So historically, the small purple pea was really widespread throughout southeastern Australia, the grassy woodlands and open forests here. Its habitat, of course, has been extensively cleared, and the species is now restricted to small and often isolated subpopulations, and I think it's still pretty much extinct in Victoria. So there's ongoing threats of habitat loss, habitat degradation, invasive weeds, again that interaction with fire regimes for a double whammy on this particular species. And recruitment is also low, probably due to low genetic diversity because of its isolation. So for this species, there's been a huge focus in raising awareness and engaging the community in its recovery. So recovery actions have included surveys, weed control, exclusion fencing, fire management, seed collection, ex situ conservation as well to support translocations. And the population trajectory of the small purple pea, which was declining in 2015, was improving in 2020. And this pea is surviving in some of our best boxgum grassy woodland habitat. And so in this respect really is a flagship species for this important ecological community across this region. And its support base is really strong. So in addition to Australian government funding, it's a focus of the New South Wales Saving Our Species program. It's got many NRM organisations involved in its recovery, Australian National Botanical Gardens, First Nations groups, Wandiali Conservation Trusts, and a swag of other community organisations who are supporting its recovery. And it would be fair to say that with this community backing, the prospects for the small purple pea are looking better. So there are several well-established, what does that mean? 1 minute? I think I'm 2 minutes. Thank you, Gary. Several well-established ingredients for success for threatened species recovery. You need to have you need to have good science. You need to have the right policy and regulatory settings. You've got to have money for people to do some of that work. But a critical ingredient for success is communicating and connecting with people to get the work done. So sharing information, knowledge and stories through a wide variety of means to reach not just the conservation audience, but a much broader sector is a really important part of my role and the role of my office. We're really active on social media, and I've shared one of my recent post that I really love here, which is focusing on baldy, the gang cockatoo. That's a recently listed species impacted through the bushfires, and a citizen science endeavour to help understand the distribution of that species better. We've just, and hopefully some of you have input into this, but just finished our major annual awareness raising activity, which is a threatened species bake-off, which has become hugely popular. A brainchild of Beck West, an ecologist from Wild Deserts. And Beck and I are the judges, and we're really thrilled to have Costa Georgiadis join us this year as a celebrity judge, not only because we love Costa, because everyone does, but because this is a really great opportunity to sort of broaden the catchment of people engaged in and aware of threatened species. And Costa was all over this and very active on social media, and I've just popped one of his quotes here, which is essentially saying, can't read it myself now, but it's essentially saying threatened species engagement and connecting people into this space is an absolute no-brainer. Oh, and I forgot to say that cake there was the Brigalow land snail, so a bit of a unique input. There's some really, really cool and crazy cakes that get submitted, and a lot of interesting information that goes with those submissions. So, thank you, upstairs. Looking ahead, so next steps for us, that's my time up. Next steps for us with the Threatened Species Action Plan, it will really guide Australian government investments and efforts over the next 10 years. It includes a focus on individual species, but also broadening that out to priority places as well. And we'll be looking to establish baseline conditions for those species and places over the next few months, and then working in partnership with many in this room, I would hope, to improve the trajectories for those over that time. So, in closing, conservation efforts across landscapes, such as the Great Eastern Ranges, are going to be critical to the recovery of threatened plants and animals in the coming years. And the need for action has never been greater. But arguably, the opportunity to make a difference is greater now than it has been in recent times. These ecosystems and their threats are complex, and action needs to both build and capitalise on people's connection to country and to nature to be successful. We can recover our most important natural places and threatened wildlife when we focus our efforts. But conservation is everyone's responsibility, and it will need all hands on deck to be successful. Thank you. "20 seconds over, sorry."